the party was, the Chicago, New York parties were key. Whereas in California, it was illegal. This was the time of Teddy Roosevelt nationally. The national groups talking about this had a big impact in California. So California local governance was much more engineers who would say there's neither a Republican nor a Democratic way to pave a road, only a good way. We want good engineering solutions. That was his style up to Prop 13. 68 and Prop 13. Then many of those managers in that style were voted out. That is, the leaders fired them. And new leaders came in. So Browning, Marshall, and Tabb document this in the 10 cities around the Bay Area. Then they've done updates, bringing especially LA, where this is even more turbulent, more dramatic, which fits with my points about the LA school, etc. Then the book, Clark, Urban Innovation, again identifies a new political culture emerging in some cities and contrasts it with class and race, ethnic politics. So we had people like Peter Flaherty, then later Bill Clinton, Tony Blair, putting these issues together in a new package of policies, which we talked about before. So what I'm stressing now is not the policies which you had before the exams, you all know about that. What I'm stressing now is the context, and how this context changed with these transformations, which are still with us today in the sense that we have some locations, relatively so, say the Scandinavian countries of Europe, or little towns like Seattle, maybe, where you have maybe 15% African Americans. They elected an African American mayor, but he clearly did not follow a Black Panthers, Black Power style. I mean, he got most of his votes from liberal whites who said, we want to have a black mayor and show the world that we are a tolerant, good place to live. And so, in that sense, ethnic mobilization along ethnic lines is not a constant. It varies. And so if you look more closely, you then find very interesting differences. For instance, the Japanese and Chinese both came to California. And the Chinese worked on building the railroads. The Japanese initially were farmers, then they went into other industries. They had lots of discrimination, but they were a small minority. They couldn't act like the blacks or the Mexicans with lots of votes. So they succeeded the most dramatically through the 20th century by just doing better at becoming doctors and lawyers and things like that. So the black nationalist style is the opposite of the Japanese style earlier or later, closer to today. The Asian Indians have been very socially and economically, they're more affluent than the Jews nationally. That's going pretty far. So the Asian Indians, but the Asian Indians did not succeed based on the civil rights style of political demonstrations. It was closer to the Japanese. Success through a meritocratic kind of pattern. Okay, so I'm giving you a little bits of ethnic history very briefly. But the key thing I'm stressing is look at the context, the three big principles of turbulence, heterogeneity of the public, and information. How much information do you have? What citizens want? It's 5. Okay. We're doing well. Okay, let me add one or two more elements to this, and then have some discussion to make this more theoretically coherent by linking with some other bits of theory which people have even talked about at this university in the last few weeks. One example was Hans Joas. Joas. He's a professor in social thought and sociology. He's written lots of books and we gave a talk recently on a new book, basically, is religion in decline? And his argument is, I mean, there's a strong argument from the 19th century that there's been a secularization movement, and after World War II in Europe, it looks pretty strong. But he argues if you look more closely at what people believe in, and what so he breaks it up into 3 types of changes, and one of which is and then he turns to, that's descriptive. Then he backs up and says, what are the theories? What are the best theories we have of this? So he focuses especially on the theories of religion from Weber and Durkheim. and Troeltsch. Troeltsch was the Troeltsch, I guess, lived in a house with Max Weber. And Troeltsch was a religious specialist who wrote about Protestantism and its importance and so forth. So Max Weber talked to Troeltsch and put these together in this famous Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism, that this Protestant sense of self-discipline and hard work and doing good works would lead to savings and success of a disciplined labor force, a military, the modern state, as well as economic success. Okay, so putting that together, what Joas, who's more of a religious specialist, then looked at more closely and said, what did Troeltsch really say? Did Weber just borrow this from Troeltsch? And the answer is no, not at all. Troeltsch himself was actually closer to Durkheim. Durkheim and Weber were the most important early 20th century founding fathers, but they never cited each other. They never really built on each other's work. In terms of religion, Weber was the individualist, with an appealing to God, but Durkheim was the opposite. He was the collectivist. And so for him, the critical way that religion could really reinforce its identity-building structure, reinforce its sense of the sacred, integrate new persons into the society, especially young men, age 13, 14, 15, 16, who were being trained and then being brought into the society, had to go through a series of tests. They had to go out in the forest, they had to kill animals, maybe kill people from another tribe. Hear that with ISIS, right? I mean, the four troops that are being investigated right now in Niger. I mean, in order for the Niger group, that was a breakaway group from Al-Qaeda, they applied to ISIS to become affiliated, not with Al-Qaeda. They wanted to join this group on going up. ISIS, we want to be part of ISIS. And the ISIS leadership said, show us you're tough. And they waited 1 year. And in that year, they started killing people more vigorously and successfully. And that group is the key group that was involved in killing the 4 American soldiers a couple of weeks ago. So what I'm getting at is the collectivism. Where and how does this come into different parts of different political systems? This is not the normal tradition of the Chinese deferential to leadership. I mean, they're classic great films and volumes written about. I mean, the emperor. There's a famous Italian film, if you Chinese haven't seen it, called The Last Emperor. Okay, The Last Emperor of China. I mean, they're fantastic shots of thousands of people, bowing and lying on the ground, praying to the emperor. Okay, that image of followers admiring the emperor permits no protest or outside. So I gave you the example I told you from the Japanese peasants. If the peasants would put a petition into the carriage of the emperor going by, the person who delivered the message would be hung because it was and so the Japanese political scientists today tell me democracy is not an Asian tradition. Certainly not a Japanese tradition. Okay, that style of hierarchy and the legitimacy as hierarchy does not permit protest. Okay, in similar manner, where does it come from? The Northern Europe, so here I go to Habermas. Habermas has a great book on his big doctorate, contrasting the continental Europeans with the English. And on the continent, Versailles was the big example, but the little German principalities were similar. They were hierarchical in the sense that they wanted no political challenges. And they killed people, they took over administration of localities. So the French state, the national state under the king, got stronger and stronger. The center of this was the court at Versailles, the Louvre, earlier years. Then they'd go around during the summer. They'd go to the chateaus of the Loire, and they had They had a sense of what you could talk about and what you could not talk about. And then this continued up through the 19th century. I've mentioned Roger Shattuck's book, The Banquet Years. They could have banquets where you could, if you're talking about workers' rights or whatever, or women or rich or poor people and their potential incipient political parties, you couldn't do that as a civic group. The police were there, inspectors were there, so you'd have banquets where you talk about these things indirectly. But more generally, the courts, and then carried on in the salons of the night, that is, civic groups were illegal, as basically they were traditionally in much of Asia. Asia had no tradition of civic groups and of a third sector, nor did the French, the Germans, the Italians, the Spanish, and so forth. What did they talk about in the courts? Love, flirtation, intrigues, political intrigues, patronage, getting jobs, doing favors. Could you connect me with him? You're a friend of his. Could you help me? That kind of thing was central. Women were central. Beauty. Okay, let me add one more big theme. Where did new culture come from in this kind of context? New styles, new cultural designs. At the end of the old regime, the person who was most visible was either the queen or, more often, the mistresses of the king. So Marie Antoinette and these ladies of around the Loire are famous subjects of novels and writing, and Saint-Simon wrote about the court life, etc., in great detail. And they made themselves beautiful, but they were elite of the elite. They spent, and they created, along with a small number of designers and things who made clothes just for them, just to fit. The designer would make, she has a body like this, I'll make that kind of a dress. Okay, flash forward to the end of the 19th century, where Baudelaire, the leading intellectual of the time, invented or developed the concept of modernism. What happens with modernism? And how do women play a critical role here again? For him, what was critical was no longer did you have this top-down of cultural imitation, which Gabriel Tarde theorized was how most innovations would spread, and Bourdieu, and others who carry on that hierarchical model. Instead, the modernism of Baudelaire was style changes all the time. And you have designers, you have fashion leaders, you have certain people in maybe one salon versus another salon, but fashion magazines then become interesting, and this then becomes critical through much of the 20th century. What's in style? Or, oh no, how could you wear that? Your hem is too long. Shoes, you can't wear those shoes. So the sense of new styles and cultural change, and Baudelaire then made the point, a lower status woman, and he was generally an isolated person, but his closest companion was a prostitute in Paris. So he saw the world through her eyes, and he would say lower status women, including prostitutes, can dress in style, and they can attract high-level men who will pay them large amounts of money if they're more attractive than their boringly dressed wives. Okay, so the idea that modernism gives cultural information, and the fact that you can change your styles to match with the elites, empowering the lower status people, women in this case, who wanted to have resonance with others in a manner which transformed the whole hierarchical perspective to a bottom-up rather than a top-down kind of model. Okay. So the idea is then that modernism with style and change, or having new kinds of running shoes, downloading on your Apple phone the right kind of music, keeping up with the new styles which young people classically do around the world more than their parents or grandparents or whatever, were part of this transformation, which I'm relating in a sense to a continuing aspect of turbulence, that is political turbulence. So that way, young people may be more sensitive to these changes, and one of the biggest examples is the counterculture, which came in the, again, with 68, the anti-Vietnam War. What was the consequence for you today? I mean, you know about feminism, the environment, human rights, and so forth because of those social movements that were created in those years because the political parties weren't doing it. So those events combined with a more tolerant, looser individualization combined with egalitarianism is stronger by far than it was before 68 throughout much of the Western world. Then is this local Western U.S. history? No. This has become global through the internet. And so you have NGOs in Thailand, in China, in Japan, working with their counterparts about women's issues, about human rights, about the environment, in ways that build on these transformations that took place earlier. Okay, so I've given you lots of historic examples, but I've tried to join them with current events integrated through some propositions about elements of where and why the context is more permeable. Then I've linked it to these changes about where, so I've interpreted where and why should Trump have an impact for his statements about immigration. And this kind of finding would suggest that the results that we heard on Monday are correct, that Trump is probably not changing most citizens' views on immigration. Most citizens are pretty much making up their minds through things which are more complicated. And the changes, the bigger changes, come through war, or new people moving in, like a new neighborhood changing, globalization at a higher level. Neighborhood used to be called invasion, as you have changes in ethnic group makeup. After World War I and World War II, African Americans came to Chicago in large numbers, fought with the Poles, the Irish, Jews, and so forth. Those then in turn leading into young, not the ethnic groups, but young urban professionals or lesbians or whatever, in certain artists in Wicker Park, Humboldt Park, and so forth. But these dynamics of neighborhood change can be interpreted with some of the same contextual propositions which I'm suggesting we can illustrate from the past. Okay, I've said that, and we've got almost 20 minutes to talk about these. That is, half of this I've invented this week. So shoot and talk, and let's discuss how we can improve the theory. Yes?
I was wondering if you could clarify a bit of what you were saying about East Asia in particular not having a culture of civic engagement, because like that's not necessarily true for like the 20th century or even earlier, at least like based on what I know about what I've learned in history class, which might be different than what you were trying to get at.
Now, what are examples the history class would
So
cite?
like in terms of like the Chinese economy was driven like as early as like the 17th century by a really intricate network of like local organizations that were not formal per se, or like codified in terms of like records, but they, had very like collectively recognized hierarchies and groups that dealt with kind of government relationships and negotiated important economic trade-offs and power relationships. And so and then we see instances of protest, definitely in 20th century China. And so like
No, I agree. Go on. Let's try to reconcile. Any further
well,
points?
and then in Japan as well, it's like despite having like,
Yes.
and I guess the argument that there's no democratic tradition, I think is just controversial given that like you do have like, only recently has there been like a decline in like violent protest and uprising. It's like 1960s, there was an instance, 1920s, and throughout the Tokugawa era, there were like several instances of like peasant rebellion in direct opposition to the authority. Because there's always been punishment for protest and like always been punishment for defiance, right? That's not necessarily unique to the Western East. So what about the hierarchy in East Asia is so unique or makes it so different than the West?
Yeah, well, what I tried to, okay, I mean, excellent points. I accept virtually everything you say. I mean, that is, I've read some of the same monographs. I mean, most visibly Max Weber's book on China, the religion of China. I mean, one way that Weber resolves this conflict, it's a conflict in interpretation, very real. You put your finger on it nicely. Is to say that you had two kinds of issue areas. And one was national and one was local. That the national policies, which affected localities through the national government bureaucracy, the mandarins, especially dealt with war, recruitment, the military, national taxation, and bigger policies of that, and many of the police were sort of national in that sense. And there was a recruitment of leadership which coordinated through the strong state of the Chinese state and the Japanese state, and the Korean was not as strong, but at least those ideals were basically the same. By contrast, locally, as Max Weber discussed it, you had an arena of local, especially economic development, where the local merchants tended to be leaders. And those merchants were critical. This was sort of a business elite kind of local, at the local level in China, which he stressed. And he stressed more of that. What you've added to what he adds is more of what I've read, at least in Japanese work, Japanese urban history, 19th, 18th century. Indeed, there were early, these seem to be created in Japan, I'm not, maybe in China. There were sort of local volunteer fire groups. They were, because you couldn't have a big professional fire department, you had neighbors who would come together to fight fires, and then those groups spread out and did other functions where they would help mobilize, and they now also do, they're now active in political campaigns. So I've had students and others who worked in Japan, and who've talked how young urban professional women, especially in Japan, go to the top universities, they get jobs at the top corporations, let's say they did 20, 30 years ago, top corporations, Toyota and so forth. Then they get married and they have a first child, and they stay at home. So these women, highly talented, good managers, well-trained, would then collaborate with often working class, less educated, older men, and those together were the core of the Liberal Democratic Party at one point, or less, or the political parties in Japanese cities and smaller towns. And they built on the tradition which you identify, and which I mean, I'm completely agreeing with. That is, you had these neighborhood associations which were sometimes secret or sometimes unclear what they were doing. They weren't that, but yes, I mean, so the simple answer of Max Weber, it's part is national, part is local, and they each had separate issue areas is a resolution, and the second is they shifted as you had especially things like these talented housewives who became locally engaged and then by the end of the 20th or beginnings of the 21st century, these groups in the bigger cities went against the LDP, so you now have in all the Japanese leading large cities, the LDP is lost, and you have fragmented, independent, good government management groups for the mayors and governors in those regions. So yes, a good point, and I and others should keep that in the analysis. Thank you. Other comments or suggestions? Go ahead.
So with Jerry Brown, like when I think of like LA's anti-establishment like sentiment, especially with Jerry Brown, I think Jerry Brown has definitely negatively affected that. And
negatively affected what?
Like anti-establishment feeling towards
Okay.
government.
I mean that he himself
Yes.
has expressed anti-establishment. Okay.
But I think he contributes to it as well.
Okay.
And I think he's definitely been better his second term, but his first term, I mean, when I think of him as first round, I think of him like sending in like helicopters to spray down California in like a pretty sci-fi, I don't know, like something out of like a sci-fi movie.
That's the LA sociological urban geographer style, yeah. Sci-fi movies. Or what was it called? Chinatown. There's a famous film called Chinatown. It's sort of the history of water. How did water get to LA and make the city possible? And it's the founding father of LA. In the epitomized, let's say, sacralized by the LA school. I would say Jerry Brown. I mean, Jerry Brown's a fascinating character. I mean, I've got books on Jerry Brown, in the sense that he was politically volatile and changed many times. When the big change that I mentioned was was pro spending versus anti spending, but then he was mayor of Oakland. He did a series of things. I mean, he had tours to Africa. I mean, that is, you're talking about recent governorship, and he was he's governor in 74 as well. So the and I've heard him talk at meetings of the Urban Affairs Association, where he discussed these issues explicitly. Plus, I worked with there's a Roger. I think his last name. He was assistant city manager in Oakland at the time of Prop 13. And he and I did some training sessions for mayors together. And he put up those signs which said, you know, this facility will be closed down if Prop 13 passed. He then wrote books interpreting what happened and decrying, I mean, the transformation among city managers in California more generally. I'm making the simple point that Oakland, Jerry Brown, the transformations of Vildovsky, the Oakland people, don't just say it's good or bad or, you know, it's this or that. They're interesting and complicated, and there's a lot to learn, as Vildovsky showed us, that you can rewrite the history of the world from the ancient Greeks to present and include Oakland in playing an important role. Other comments, questions? How about our two TAs? Whitney, you've thought about culture. I'm trying to say, where and why does culture matter? That's one theme which is semi-explicit here.
That's an enormous question. I'm not sure how to approach it.
Well, I threw out about 15 variables and how they work, and reviewed a lot of past literature that supports, you know, from Max Weber and Durkheim. You know, just one more word on Durkheim. That is the collectivism. Yeah, let me make one more linkage, which I maybe didn't make explicit enough. As the Southern European tradition was the cafe and the street, in contrast to the Northern Europeans I talked about with Scandinavia. So Scandinavia, homogeneity, propriety, Robert's rules, New England town meeting. Southern Europe was more like the LA, in the sense of having people in the street, having gangs and battles among the gangs, and this then continues on in Africa today, but the big part of the transformation point from 68 to present is the Southern European traditions have come to China, Denmark, and transformed the neat, proper hierarchy of the bureaucracy. And so California city manager government is shaken up by this Southern European cafe demonstration style of the street. And so we have today not just the potential, that is, just take two examples, Kiev and Cairo. That is, you also have Syria, Iraq, and so forth. We've got wars going on. People are killing each other on and on for years. But in Kiev and Cairo, where you had huge demonstrations, thousands of young people protesting in the streets, only after a week or so, the president of both of those countries resigned and said, the people are against me, I resign and I give, you can choose another president. That never happened in earlier years. That is, the point is, the power, the political ability to transform the political leadership nationally, not to mention locally, fits with this in times of turbulence and mobilization in ways that happen relatively peacefully. That is, there were burnings, but there were very few people killed in Kiev or in Cairo in a week or two, but there were people who were angry. They're giving speeches, they had poets, they had movies, they had singing. It was like a civil rights, 68 in Western Europe and the US. But the point is, it worked so powerfully that the president of the countries resigned. Okay. End of comment. We will continue next Monday. Comments, reactions, criticisms, this is an excellent point. Thank you. I've got to build it in. Okay.